I think now we'll move to our final paper, back to the perspective of the Ukraine, where we will have a presentation now from Charles Kelly, who goes by Kelly. Kelly's been involved in disaster risk management for over 40 years, primarily working in international humanitarian assistance and disaster risk management. To date, he has worked in over 60 countries and is looking forward to learning more about people confronting and reducing the impact of disasters, as all disaster management is local. Kelly, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Today, I'm going to talk about greening the humanitarian response in Ukraine. And I'll start out by saying that I'm actually speaking in a very non-official situation. I've been working in Ukraine for a number of years, mostly remotely, although I had visited the country once or twice. So I'm going to be providing more or less a perspective from a responder working on the issues in Ukraine, looking at the environmental side of things. But nothing I'm saying should be considered official or representing the parties that I might have been working with over time. Thank you. Okay, you're probably very familiar with the country context for Ukraine, but I'll just go over it fairly briefly here. It's a heavily industrialized country. It's a transitional country in many senses since the break of the Soviet Union and becoming independent. And it's a country where there's a lot of resource extraction. Coal mining, of course, is something that we know a lot about now, but there's a lot of other resources that are extracted in the country. And there's also a lot of work in the country that transforms these resources into other products that are sold in the country and also sold internationally. It's a highly urbanized country. 70% of the population lives in urban areas, and several of the cities are actually quite large and with a lot of built infrastructure. What's interesting also is that Ukraine is a major agricultural country. Although 30% of the population is living in rural areas, it's a major exporter of food products globally, and as we know, a key player in the international food security constellation. Population is relatively well educated, and there's a high degree of integration in lifeline and common services. And when I speak about common services, I'm talking about that set of things like communications, electricity, rail transport, other things like that provide services for the citizens and the residents in the country. And it's a well-integrated system, not just the lifelines, but all the services that are there. And of course, Ukraine is, as we've learned in the last 6 months or so, well integrated into the global economy. So the natural environment, it's a country of grasslands, beaches, and mountains. It has quite a long coastline because of Crimea, but Odessa, for instance, in the south is a destination, a vacation destination during the summer. We also have the mountains in the east. The mountains in the west, the Carpathian Mountains, and then the major rivers running through the country. And this makes it quite an interesting natural environment for a country of its size. And so there's quite a diversity of environments. It has a continental climate, as we all fairly well aware of at this point, meaning that it gets very cold in the winter and it can get quite warm during the summer. And as we're moving into the winter period, the continental climate issue is quite important. The country has a lot of what we call environmentally unique areas. The Sea of Azov is one, coastal areas, but also the mountains and grasslands in other areas of the country are areas that are either designated as a national park or recognized as having some particularly important environmental value. Unfortunately, partly as a legacy of the Soviet period, but for other reasons, the country itself has a number of environmental hotspots where the industrialization and resource extraction has resulted in environmental damage. And over time, a continued need to try to address negative environmental impacts from this kind of situation. Interestingly, the country has actually quite active civil society and active environmental NGOs, some associated with international organizations like WWF, World Wildlife Fund, and others domestically developed. And these organizations have been involved in considering environmental issues within the country and also trying to address and promote attention to some of the environmental challenges the country faces. The country itself, interestingly, has sort of a contrasting policy here. It's a country that promotes nuclear power generation. It is a country with, as we know, a large number and some very large nuclear power plants. It's one of the few countries in the world that's experienced a large nuclear power plant accident. Yet there's also a very strong push for viral protection of the environmentally unique and different interesting areas in the country. So I look at the conflict situation. It started as a physical conflict back in 2014 in Donbass, in the eastern part of the country, and also in Crimea. There wasn't, well, there was damage done in Donbass as part of the conflict, but it wasn't as much as we've seen now more recently. And a lot of it came from actually just the fact that it stopped industry, and particularly coal mining, and resulted in issues, for instance, contaminated water from coal mines and other issues that have to do with the fact that facilities weren't able to operate normally, although some others have been able to operate normally throughout the conflict. In terms of damage to the built environment, it wasn't that great because there wasn't much built environment that was actually directly on the line of conflict. So there was fighting, and in some cities there was fighting, but nothing to the scale that we've seen today. And as a result, for the humanitarian community, the environmental issues had a relatively low salience. There was discussion about some of them, but it was a combination of not that much damage occurring, and also a very difficult environment to provide assistance or to address environmental issues, particularly on either side, the other side of the line of conflict. Since February, the situation has evolved considerably, as I think we're all aware. What we're seeing is a military campaign process that is fundamentally a process of destroying the built environment. And when we say built environment here, I should be clear that we're talking about not only buildings, but roads, support infrastructure, water treatment plants, sewage treatment plants, heating infrastructure. Anything that has been built up is being leveled in a practical sense. And this is significant because of the scale that it's happening at, which is probably even greater than any similar kind of conflict since the Second World War, and certainly greater than some of the ongoing conflicts that we see elsewhere in the world. There's been a lot of damage to industrial sites, and this, of course, leads to issues with environmental contamination, from contamination to air pollution, ground pollution, groundwater pollution, but also the inability of organizations who would address those problems to actually try to remediate or minimize the problem. Most recently, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen a significant degradation of the electrical infrastructure. And given the developed nature of Ukraine, the electrical infrastructure is critical for transport. It's critical for pumping water from the ground up to the 9th floor of an apartment building. It's critical for food production. It's critical for food storage. It's critical for almost every other element of life within the country. And so as the electrical system is degraded as part of the conflict, we're going to see knock-on effects from that. And several will have to do with industrial base, the ability of industry to keep functioning and to manage hazardous materials within the factory, for instance, and also in the waste management capacity. When power's knocked out, pumps don't work, treatment facilities may not be working, and there may be other knock-on effects on the environment that we will see over time. Unfortunately, we can anticipate that the degrading of the built environment will continue for the foreseeable future. So there'll be a lot more destruction of the built environment, a lot more debris, a lot more other consequences of that in terms of reduction in the systems that support the population. And when we look at this a little bit more detail, we're looking at significant, what we might call secondary impacts. The three I'd like to mention here. The first is explosives. Now, we have unexploded munitions, UXEs, which are things that haven't blown up. And so they need special treatment, of course. But we also have cases where explosives have partly exploded, and therefore they remain a risk of further explosion if they're handled improperly. But also explosives themselves, particularly concentrated in specific locations, can end up contaminating the ground and to a lesser extent the air around them. And these contaminated materials can actually move into the water table if there's sufficient rainfall in the right conditions. And so dealing with explosives is not only making unexploded ordnances safer, but it's also dealing with the chemical and environmental consequences of what has exploded or partly exploded. So that's a very highly specialized requirement. The second is that there's also what we might call toxic debris. So you have the debris from buildings and everything else that's been destroyed. When you look at it, that debris, particularly, for instance, in an apartment house complex that's been collapsed, that debris contains a lot of things in it that might be toxic. So in every apartment, in a building that had 40 apartments, there's cleaning materials. There may be oils, gasoline, even. There may be pesticides. And as the buildings collapse, all those things are brought together into a sort of homogenized pile of stuff. And as that debris is sorted, as it's cleared out and sorted, those toxic materials need to be taken out and processed correctly. Now, we understand how to do that. That knowledge has been around for quite some time. There's actually a manual on how to do that process. But we face two things, one of which is the scope of the debris that needs to be managed. There's a tremendous amount. And the second is the diversity of the toxic materials within the debris. And so this is a specific and very, what do you call it, very daunting challenge that needs to take place. It's the debris in Ukraine just can't be bulldozed up and put in dump trucks and dumped someplace. It has to be processed correctly. Otherwise, you'll just end up with more environmental issues downstream. As I said, we know how to deal with this. It's just putting in places the capacities, which would be significant to deal with the toxic debris. And then finally, we have the issue of asbestos. I'll come back to that a little bit in a minute. But asbestos is found within the built environment in Ukraine. It's been used there for decades, if not a century. And it presents some very specific management challenges that need to be dealt with in a way separate from the toxic debris, because it has to be dealt with separately in a way that's different. And it's an issue that is gaining importance within Ukraine now, but one that hasn't really gotten a lot of attention in terms of capacities for doing it. So I look at the environmental humanitarian response, what I've been involved in working remotely, unfortunately, and trying to support the humanitarian response in the country. Well, the environmental issues we were looking at were relatively limited during the Donbass phase, the earlier phase of the conflict. We were aware of some things and we had some discussions, but there really wasn't either the scale of issues or the ability to do things that allowed us to move forward on them. I say that noting that there had been a lot of information, collected about some of the problems, for instance, the flooding of the coal mines and some other issues during that period, but there wasn't much action that could be taken in more recent times. There's been a significant increase in the engagement of local civil society, particularly environmental NGOs, on the environmental consequences of the conflict. And this is significant because where I speak about humanitarian assistance, it's usually considered outside assistance to the country, where here we have a lot of interest and effort being put forward by organizations within the country that are not part of the government about understanding the environmental consequences of the conflict and looking forward to ways to address them. So what we've moved towards now in the last 6 months, or maybe a little bit less, is trying to better understand and document the environmental impacts of the conflict. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. One is that since the beginning of this phase of the conflict, there's been a lot of discussion about reparations, payments by one party of the conflict to the other to cover the cost of the damage to the built infrastructure and essentially to the overall environment in the country. And to do that, you need to document the cost, the nature of the damage and destruction, and the cost of that damage and destruction. So developing a database of that kind of information is quite important. The second is to understand the real scale of these environmental issues, because they're variable and they take place in a lot of different places and happen on a constant basis within the country. It's quite a daunting task to just keep up to date on it, but you need a system so that you know where things are happening and what has happened. I can provide an example of an effort by an organization. This is Zoe Network, and a number of other organizations that have Zoe Environment Network and a number of organizations that have come together. This is a screenshot of a live map. You can go into this map and zoom in to different locations. And what it does is try to collect together information on damage to critical infrastructure, fires, other kinds of environmental issues that have been collected from public sources, news reports and other reports, and is put together on a periodic basis. It's not updated daily, but it's updated fairly regularly to collect information about where damage to the environment or environmental consequences and risks are taking place. Now, this information is very useful, and there's an effort underway now to expand this and make this a much more detailed documentation of the environmental impact of the conflict. And so this is a very interesting option or opportunity, and it sort of reflects the capacities of civil society in Ukraine, because much of the information comes from Ukraine, and an interest in pulling together information about what's happening during the conflict so that there's a clear idea about consequences and risks. Now, another reason for this documentation process is to provide a basis for rapid response to critical threats. As you can see from the previous slide, there's a lot of things that have happened and are happening in Ukraine in terms of potential environmental damage across a wide range of sectors, everything from nuclear power to damage to water pipelines and other kinds of water treatment facilities. And so there's a need to understand, to identify where the problems are, and also to rate the risks involved or how threatening are the different problems identified, so that there can be a rapid response if necessary. So for instance, if it's identified that there's a factory that has the potential for leaking a highly dangerous chemical, you want to be able to identify that quickly, rate that threat, and then be able to dispatch teams to take care of that problem. Partly reflecting the fact that not all the factories are continuing to operate in normal conditions, and so there may not even be staff locally who can deal with the problems, and you need to send in special teams to deal with this. So this is an effort that's just started being put in place, and provides a very interesting opportunity to try to more rapidly and more effectively reduce the most critical threats to the environment from the conflict. There's an effort ongoing now, just starting now, to build government capacities to do the things I just mentioned about understanding and documenting environmental impacts and the response capacity. And here we're merging humanitarian assistance and development outcomes. And it's a bit of an unusual situation because usually there's a sharp divide between humanitarian assistance and development. But in this case, unfortunately, Ukraine is an extraordinary case where there are very few countries in the world that have had to deal with this massive level of damage to the built environment and environmental damage from the conflict as part of the way that the government operates. So the government needs capacities developed to understand where the problems lie and how they should be addressed. And this is something that very few other countries have had to develop. And so developing the short-term capacities to respond now is also something that needs to be put in place so the government can continue to do this over the coming years and probably more than decades ahead. So I want to come back to asbestos because it's something I've been spending a bit of time on. You may be aware that asbestos is banned or significantly prescribed in limited use in a number of countries. The challenge in Ukraine is that it's ubiquitous in the built environment. You have asbestos in roofing sheets, you have asbestos in concrete, you have asbestos in water pipes, you have asbestos in lots of things, widely used. Now, asbestos has been banned in Ukraine. A law that was enacted a few months ago. It'll be a year before the law is fully implemented. However, we have decades, if not a century, of use of asbestos in the country. And this is all in the built environment. And as the built environment is being destroyed, asbestos is being released into the environment. And this poses an immediate risk to the people who are cleaning up the debris, but also those who are repairing and upgrading buildings after the conflict. And so what we need to do is both establish methods for safe use or safe handling of asbestos, which are really not that complicated, but need to be considered as in a way that's operational and also communicating these procedures to those who might be exposed to asbestos so that we can reduce the risk. Now, there is a short-term risk from asbestos, and there's also a long-term risk. So we're looking at both something that needs to be put in place now, and also something that will have a positive impact in the future if done properly. So that's an area that we're focusing on. And although we've dealt with asbestos in some other countries in humanitarian response, this is quite a large challenge here, simply because of the scope of the damage that's being done. The second area that I've been looking at, I've been working on, is integrating environmental capacities into operations. Now, in general, when you do a project, you do an environmental review, you develop an environmental management plan, you implement the plan, and that's it. That's how you mitigate or manage the environmental consequences. In a conflict, probably not the best time to do an environmental impact assessment. You can do a strategic environmental assessment, but still, when you get down to the field level, the people actually in this field, they can't, in many cases, it's not practical to do detailed assessments before starting an activity. For instance, going to a village and repairing 20 houses. You're not really going to be able in a humanitarian context to do that, do a detailed assessment, go away and come back a couple of weeks later to repair the houses, partly because people themselves will go ahead and start repairing the houses anyway. So you want to be involved directly with how people are doing that and have it a very quick and timely engagement with the affected population. So what we want to look at is providing the people in the field, in this case, both Ukrainians and the international humanitarian community, staff in the field, tools that they can use to quickly assess what might be the most salient and most significant environmental threats that they will face in the work that they're doing almost on a daily basis at a project level or an activity level, and then allow them to start making adjustments based on guidance that we can provide to how they do things to reduce the risk. Asbestos is specifically a case where we're trying to do that, but there are other environmental issues that we also want to try to consider. So these are two areas that we're focusing on, addressing asbestos, and then also trying to, I wouldn't say downscale, move down the capacity to understand environmental issues and take action to address them. Now, looking forward, I would say we face a challenge in raising or keeping up the environmental profile. Frankly, if I go to people and talk about asbestos, they will say, well, that's a long-term issue, and we're dealing with people dying today. That's something we can deal with later. In general, when we speak about the environment, it's the same issue. Well, the environment's something we can deal with later, we deal with the immediate crisis. So we need to communicate that dealing with environmental issues in Ukraine is something that's related directly to the humanitarian response, directly to saving lives and supporting people in difficult situations. And we've been trying to work on this and linking environmental interventions, such as with asbestos or other kinds of guidance, to the operational context that's currently faced in Ukraine. We do have winter coming on, and there will be a significant challenge, particularly because of the events, or more so because of the events in the last couple of weeks, because of the reduced ability to rely on electricity for heating as an alternative to natural gas supplies or other supplies. And this will most likely shift to a greater emphasis on using coal and wood for heating. And that presents a whole set of issues, not only external pollution, air pollution outside buildings, but also air pollution inside buildings and air quality issues that can have a significant negative impact on health rather quickly. So we want to look at that in more detail as the situation evolves. We have to understand that there will be more damage to the built environment. The prospect now is that anything on the near a front line will be destroyed to a large extent. And also degradation of the support systems, I mentioned, the electricity, the gas supplies, central heating, the railways, communication systems, all these other support systems that are critical in an industrialized country like Ukraine to managing the environmental impacts of living in urban areas, of processing hazardous materials, of resource extraction. There will be more debris. There will be more asbestos. And there will be more locations where toxic chemicals or toxic products have been released into the environment. And these are all things we need to anticipate going forward. There is actually already a push for more rapid recovery. There was a conference a couple of months ago already about planning the recovery from the conflict. This will involve a large-scale rebuilding of Ukraine. Probably the closest examples have been the rebuilding of parts of Europe after the Second World War. This is because of the destruction to the built environment. There will be, we understand there's already been pushes to try to reduce and remove environmental controls, environmental review procedures, and other things like that, because they're seen as hindering the rebuilding process. The reality is, from evidence and experience in other countries, is that once these procedures are removed, we usually end up with more damaging environmental consequences than if they had been followed. But the challenge is to make sure that those review procedures can be done quickly and succinctly so that they don't present a barrier to the rebuilding process, which will move forward as quickly as it can. The reality is also that we're going to be dealing with conflict-related environmental issues in Ukraine for a very long time. Even if the conflict stops today, which I would hope it would, there'll still be thousands of tons of debris that needs to be sifted through. The toxic materials need to be removed. The asbestos needs to be safely managed. And that will go on for years. And this is just a reality that Ukraine, unfortunately, because of the conflict, if it were to stop today, would be spending a decade or more just dealing with the environmental consequences of the conflict. Now, turning back to the point about keeping up the profile for the environment and humanitarian response, what we need to do is communicate it in the short term as looking at environmental issues as a way to improve the humanitarian impacts of the assistance we're providing, how to make that assistance more effective and efficient by considering environmental issues. We're spending a lot of attention on trying to promote that point. And the second is over the long term, particularly in terms of long-term rebuilding, is trying to prevent avoidable environmental damage during the rebuilding process. Thank you very much. I hope this has been a useful presentation of my perspective on greening the humanitarian response in Ukraine. As I said before, this is my personal opinion and doesn't reflect the views of anybody else, as far as I can understand at the moment. But if you do have any questions or comments for me, my email address is here. Please feel free to contact me. I have not provided an extensive bibliography of resources. There's quite a lot available on the Ukraine. There's quite a lot available on Ukraine, and it would have taken up another 15, 20 minutes to present it all. So if you want more information, please contact me or simply Google Environment Ukraine, and you'll get a lot of information. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kelly. It was great to get a perspective that goes beyond the tip of the news of death and destruction. We've had an exciting session today, and we've come to the end. We've seen quite a bit today. We started out with a panel presentation on TQC, TQAC, the TIEMS certifications. And I think hearing from those people who have gone through the process gave us a glimpse of what certification can mean beyond just reading about the procedures. I hope all of you in the audience found it informative. And I have to say, as one of the authors of the process, it was gratifying for me to hear the value it is giving people to the people we designed it for. After the first panel, Dr. Jeffrey Stearns gave his keynote speech on the future of emergency management training. And it showed us some exciting plans to integrate training in the U.S. across government organizations, and also insight into the challenging gap between what's offered and what the uptake is of educational programs intended to improve professional competence. Next, Kyle King and Carl Taylor described very boots on the ground effort to deal with the challenges of providing humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Next, we had three very interesting presentations of a Chinese perspective on the scope of EM disasters and emergencies there, early warning and emergency broadcast systems, and the Chinese emergency management plans and strategies to deal with the particular profile of emergencies in China and its organizations and politics. And finally, we heard about emergency response in Ukraine relating to communications restoration using satellite communications and addressing environmental concerns while we're employing humanitarian efforts. So that ends our session today, unless Harold has any additional comments. Thank you very much for your attendance, your comments, your participation, and particularly to all the speakers. Thank you very much.